Chapter 15 Lost to Power. Team Kiba, Aging Apartment, Lima, Peru. The 4 members of Team Kiba had spent close to 4 hours inside a rather run-down apartment. The building was old, ill-kept and in strong need of some rather rudimentary repairs. None of the 4 had any desire to spend more time in the building than was absolutely necessary, but unfortunately that was what being there was. Necessary. It was for 3 main reasons. Firstly, it had been one of the rooms closest to the rooftop of the building and as such had been very easy for the group to access from their high-rise escape of the enthralled civilians. Secondly, large parts of the building were abandoned. Avoiding detection was rather critical now that they had encountered their target and had no means to tell who was under his influence or who still had their own free will. Lastly, and quite possibly most importantly, the 2-room apartment's east window had a good view of the Basilica Cathedral de Lima, the main Roman Catholic cathedral in all of Peru. Initially, Asia had voiced concerns that perhaps this was the wrong location to be surveying. After all, their enemy could have chosen any number of locations to establish as a base of operations, but those doubts had quickly been laid to rest. Within the first half hour of observation, dozens of townsfolk with the same glazed-over expression had routinely entered and exited the large colonial structure. It appeared as if they were conducting some form of work tasks, bringing in materials and leaving to collect more or run errands. If that hadn't been enough, Zenobia had recognized a pair of fallen angels from her organization's intelligence files. The rebellious traitors appeared to be acting as sentries, with one always outside in an alley or alcove of the main entrance at all times. For the most part, both remained outside. Never together, but always within view of each other. This told Kiba a few things that led the Gremory Knight to strategies. The enemy were aware that they would be targeting the cathedral or at least suspected an attack, and therefore they were alert. Now that it was confirmed that fallen angels were present, the 4 had to be more careful. In daylight, the enemy could match the devils in strength, speed, and magical ability. At dawn and dusk, they gained more power and would be dangerous, especially if they succeeded in trapping or ambushing the group. Night was when Kiba and Asia would have an advantage. Unfortunately, the enemy knew this. If they didn't, then they were idiots, and Kiba knew that you should never assume anything about your enemy, especially that they were an idiot. It was for those reasons that the 4 of them had come up with a slightly unorthodox and possibly foolish plan. It could very well have been described as a downright stupid plan, but in these situations the difference between genius and stupidity could often come down to simple timing or luck. The plan would be executed at 6 in the afternoon, a little over an hour away. The prime time for dusk, when the enemy are naturally at their strongest. Infiltrating the cathedral would consist of Zenobia and Irina taking on the role of controlled civilians. The workers had been bringing in large pallets and boxes of materials the entire time that the group had observed them. As such, Kiba and Asia will lay inside a long flat-pack pallet, often used for carrying wood. Zenobia and Irina will then push a hand lorry with the pallet on it up and into the cathedral. The girls easily possessed the enhanced strength to carry the pallet by hand, but that would give them away, as there was no way that anyone would believe that 2 rather petite young women of their size could carry a load as such. With the time to execute their plan approaching, the 2 girls slipped away to acquire some rough clothing to wear over their own clothes. It was obvious that the majority of the bewitched workers were from the lowest socioeconomic strata of Lima. While neither girl was happy with the idea of stealing clothing, both knew that it served a far greater good to be able to blend in. They would of course return the borrowed garments later. During the time it took the 2 human girls to find suitable attire, Kiba ventured out cautiously into the streets of Lima. Using the Maps application of his phone, he made his way toward an industrial suburb where he acquired a hand trolley and goods pallet. Both items that he intended to return as well. Devils were many things, but heartless thieves was not one of them. Getting the items back to the apartment was harder and considerably more time-consuming, but eventually the Gremory Knight returned to find his 3 female compatriots ready to enact their plan. Asia had kept observation of their target the whole time. There has been no change. People continue to come and go. The 2 sentries haven't moved either. She informed her boyfriend at the back door to the building. They were all on the ground floor, with the pallet and trolley being too big and cumbersome to bother to haul up inside. Kiba simply nodded to her, acknowledging what she had said with a simple "Thanks. What would I ever do without you?" The ex-nun returned his question with a cheeky grin and a kiss. At that, the pair climbed inside the crate before the two Templar women closed up the container and secured it with packing straps that Kiba had picked up. The straps gave the whole disguise that extra quality that made it believable. If the worst came to pass, any of them could just rip through the pallet and straps to free them. With the straps secure, Irina and Zenobia pushed the trolley forward with fake exertion. It was barely a stroll for the girls, but they played the part of impoverished laborers well. Faded, partially torn hoodies pulled up but not fully over their faces, giving some protection from direct inspection without appearing suspicious or underhanded. Both holy women felt the nerves tingle and create butterflies in their stomachs as they passed the location of the rebel Grigori members. Both had fought before but never one-on-one with an angel or devil. Supernatural beings of that class were not allocated for human warriors to face. Relief filled Zenobia as they passed unhindered, while Irina continued to remain more on edge. She had always been the more serious of the pair. The pair put in the extra grunts and shoves of believable difficulty as they rolled the trolley up the ramp to the cathedral's doors. The large double-set ornate wooden doors lay open before them, and the trolley made a gentle thunk as it rolled onto the paved floor of the cathedral's entryway. To say that the pair felt uncomfortable as they entered the grand building would be a vast understatement. Men and women stood transfixed in small groups throughout the building, chanting unknown words in an almost inhumane voice. Their voices sounded almost to be the same, and Irina heavily suspected that it was not the voices of the people themselves, but rather the something that had them transfixed. As if speaking through them. It was a disembodied sound that could not be placed as either male or female regardless of the person chanting. Moving between them, other individuals carried on working. Carrying and moving various materials toward a grotesque totem being erected in the center of what was previously the seating for the procession. Pew seating had either been shoved aside against the walls or broken apart into crude crucifixes. Over a dozen crucifixes made up the totem with unfortunate souls nailed to them. The poor individuals being crucified chanted in the same voice, tone, and words of the groups around them, even as their blood oozed from them into the unholy construct. Worse yet, 5 renegades of the Grigori walked around openly among them. Their vile black wings on display with long-bladed knives of red and orange energy cutting into the chanters at random. Scattered across the ground was a black grainy substance, much like crushed rock or gemstones. As the blood of the chanters reached the floor, it bonded with the black material and in doing so formed a red mist that swirled into the air. All the swirls of red twisted and contorted through the air as if by one will towards a series of crystals, dark as midnight black, that hung above the macabre totem, greedily absorbing all the offerings fed upon them. Following the other thralls carrying various materials, the pair of trespassers moved to a doorway on the far left side of the room. The room contained all forms of raw materials required to build more demented totems or suspend other crystals should the need arise. It was obvious immediately that this group planned to be in operation for the long haul. The thralls neither acknowledged nor noticed the 2 girls and their cargo, which for the pair was the perfect outcome. Both holy warriors suspected that these people had no ability to control their actions, but that may prove beneficial if that also meant that they were unable to alert the rogue Grigori to their presence. Irina and Zenobia moved slowly around the trolley, waiting for the room to become vacant. It was too early in the infiltration to blow their cover by relying on the thralls' lack of attendance. Their patience was rewarded as the room became theirs after a mere few minutes. Quick rips on the packing straps freed the lid of the trolley, allowing it to slide off. Zenobia eased it to the ground quietly as Irina kept watch. Asia and Kiba climbed out awkwardly, with the knight following his girlfriend from the cramped confines. The pair stretched themselves out. It had only been 15 minutes, but still plenty of time to feel tight after being so cramped up. With his body more limber, Kiba joined Irina by the open door. The next step is where this plan took on a far more bold design. It was simple yet highly risky. So far, approaching at dusk had paid off. The fallen angel's natural affinity for the twilight hours had led them into a false sense of security that greatly assisted the success of their infiltration into the cathedral. Now was the time to strike hardest before they would know what was happening to them. To that extent, Kiba and Asia summoned their wings whilst drawing out their power to its fullest extent. Moments later, the two Gremory devils burst from the storage room. Neither had seen the grotesque scene that occupied the once holy structure. Kiba didn't let the vile happenings affect him. He focused solely on closing with and targeting the closest Gregory. Asia, however, found it hard not to be bewitched and appalled by what confronted her. So many innocent souls suffering caused both anger and pain in her heart. She channeled that into a drive to save as many of these people as she could. To that end, she had to help Kiba defeat the adversaries that came before them. A long abyssal blade formed in Kiba's hands instantly as he charged the first Gregory. The male angel turned with a look of utter bewilderment toward the devil charging at him. Before he could formulate any aspects of a response, the long dark crackling blade pierced into his skin and Kiba tore it upward, slicing the adversary in twain. Yells, screams, shouts and utter chaos erupted within the cathedral. Thralls that were chanting in small groups stopped their unholy cacophony while workers dropped anything and everything they were carrying. As if by one will, the controlled masses turned on the two devils while three more Gregory leapt forward to assault the Gremory pair. Kiba matched them by summoning more blades to wield both physically and telepathically whilst taking flight. In the air he could fight without worry about the grabbing hands of the bewitched masses. He still had to contend with projectiles that they hurled though, however that is where Asia stepped in. She combined two spells that she had previously been mastering and unleashed them simultaneously. At that moment all the various light sources, be they man-made or natural, flared greatly. The whole structure shone like a miniature sun. As the flare subsided, Asia unleashed the wind spell that Akino had taught her. Not too powerfully so as to hurt the people, but forcefully enough to throw them back. A few crashed into walls or broken wood, causing minor injuries, but the majority were none the worse for wear. As the light subsided, three Gregory bodies collapsed to the ground, dead before they lay still. Kiba and Asia had left for only a second when the holy warriors made their move. The pair dashed from the room and into an adjacent hall. With the devils raising hell combating the Gregory forces, it was the perfect cover for the two Templar women to search out their primary target. Down through the first left turn and then a right, the two girls moved. Not running but moving with intent. Their goal was to head below ground, to the vaults and catacombs that inhabited below the cathedral. It was their best bet of where they would find freed. Two doors opened to the right while another lay ahead. The door to their front began to open, causing the pair to maneuver into the first opening to the right. They found themselves in an empty lay sister's bedroom. Pressing themselves against the walls adjacent the doorway, they watched quietly as a group of thralls rushed past, heading toward the main floor. It was obvious that the being controlling these people was amassing them to deal with their Gremory allies. Irina felt a stab of worry for Asia and Kiba, followed immediately by internal confusion and worrying for devils. Shaking her head slightly, she led Zenobia back out into the hallway. Glancing at her friend and partner, the two simultaneously nodded toward the far doorway that the thralls had come through before heading upward. Without a better way to go, the direction their adversaries had emerged from was the best. The doorway revealed a spiraling staircase leading steeply downward. The air grew even more still and was pungent with a stale stench as the girls tread upon each cold stone step. The only light being artificial from the small round LEDs inset into the walls that created an uncomfortable sterility. One that was adding another layer of unease to the pair. The stairway ended in the beginning of the sprawling catacombs, a building unto itself beneath the cathedrals. Hallways and storerooms, intended to hide away the treasures of the cathedral in times past, now used to store things that the church would rather left unseen. The closest rooms contained supplies that the rogue group had gathered, yet more evidence of their intent to remain for the long haul. Minutes passed as the girls moved onward. No longer could they hear the echoes of the fight that was raging above them. They both silently hoped that was only because of the vastness of earth between them and their new allies. Neither felt comfortable in calling the Gremory devils friends, however both had noticed that compassion and care with which all the devils of House Gremory seemed to possess, something that contravened their teachings. Pushing those thoughts aside, they ignored the intricacies of their alliance and the far less pleasing possibility of what could have occurred to the two devils. The third hall that they came to ended in a pair of ornate doors. Silver and onyx carvings adorned both doors and the frame around them. Images of creatures intertwined in some kind of ritualistic display. This line split down the center where the doors would part. The pattern of a star and cross graced the walls around the ornate carvings. It all seemed to come together to depict something specific. Neither holy warrior had time to ponder the depicted scene though, as the doors opened abruptly. Zenobia darted behind a jutting section of the stone hallway while Irina was left exposed to the view of the winged individual that moved toward her. Immediately the holy warrior took on a dazed expression. Her instincts and training telling her that appearing to be a thrall was her only option, whilst internally she fought against the overwhelming urge to panic. The winged individual was a female of approximate 5.5 feet in smooth olive skin, black curly hair, bright lime eyes and of most prominence, a pair of large black feathered wings. She approached the scared girl speaking with a voice that rang of contempt, hatred and ill intent. "Stupid thrall, what are you doing down here?" It was clear that she asked the question rhetorically. "I guess I will just have to cut you up, enjoy you a bit as I bring you back to the surface." Her voice became more sinister as she reached Irina, her hand grasping the girl by the shoulder to drag her along. Irina felt the initial tug as the angel moved past her, but then it stopped and a gurgling noise spluttered out, replacing her cold voice. Irina turned to see Zenovia's Durandal protruding through the throat of the vile Grigori. Her partner had used the distraction she had provided to strike from the shadows while their enemy was complacent. The holy sword twitched to the side, freeing itself from the flesh of the fallen angel as Zenobia stepped around the crumpling body of their enemy that sagged onto the floor. Irina looked to her friend and partner, both girls' expressions said the same thing. She had just killed an angel. A fallen angel, but still an angel. Blood had spurted from the wound onto both girls' clothing. Irina scanned every inch of the space around them. There was nowhere to hide the body. She took a deep breath and then summoned her own weapon, Gallatin, and the pair continued on. Their blades held at the ready in front of them. Both warriors felt more on edge as they crept through the rooms and halls beyond the heavily ornate doors. No longer was the area used for storage, but now was clearly the living area of the rogue Grigori. A fact that was unsettling to the girls. Beds with personal belongings filled the rooms. Sometimes single beds, other times doubles. Irina counted almost 30 spaces. That was a lot of Grigori in one location, and now that they had discarded their disguise and held weapons openly, she felt exposed at the idea of being attacked. With the blood on them, it would have been impossible to pretend to be a thrall though. As they neared the end of the accommodation area, a clinking sound began to fill the air. An open stairwell led to the left further down, but a booth opening provided a viewing window of sorts into the source of the noise. Concealing themselves as best as they could, the girls peered through and were made far more uncomfortable by what lay before them. On a large open landing below, one that the staircase clearly led to, was what could only be described as a packing floor. Crates piled high, full of the dark crystals pulsing with the foul red mist energy. Thralls packed, sealed, and moved the crates onto a large sigil of twin skulls, the sigils colored in amethyst and white. Neither skull appeared to be humanoid, but not quite right. When the boxes were packed, a light would glow and flash before the crates would vanish. The constant clinking seemed to be the sound of hundreds of crystals being loaded into the crates. Worse still, close to a dozen Grigori moved between them, and standing next to the sigil, bouncing and twitching in place, was none other than their target. Freed Selzen. The pair pulled back and moved into a bunk out of sight. With the constant sound of the crystals tapping against each other, the boxes moving and the voices on the large floor, the girls could afford to speak softly. Still, they kept their eyes trained on the entranceway. If a shadow moved, they would become silent instantly. "Should we get Kiba and Asia?" Zenobia asked in a tone that was not quite panicked, but not all that far from it either. "No," Irina replied with a voice a bit more stoic. "We have a job to do, they are doing theirs. Or you know they were, but I haven't heard." Zenobia cut her off before she could continue the train of thought. They are fine, we are just so far away, with so much earth between us. Anyway, you saw how quickly they are packing down there. If the devils weren't raising hell so to speak, do you think they would be shipping out the crystals so quickly? Zenobia's voice gained some confidence as her own argument for the continued existence of their allies raised her own faith as well. Irina had to admit that her friend made a few very valid points and simply nodded, "You're right." A moment of silence sat between them before she continued, "We need to find a way to tip the odds in our favor momentarily." Zenobia slumped back with her arms behind her onto the bed that she sat on. Her hand rested on the cheap wooden frame as she thought. She squeezed her hand closed and then open again as she thought. Something that she had done since a small child. On the third squeeze a small crunch was heard and she sat up to find that she had snapped part of the frame off. She felt sheepish for a moment before an idea came to her mind. "What if," she began, "we could get them all out of the room?" She flicked the broken wood in her hand as she spoke. "Well, that would be great." "How?" Irina asked bluntly. Zenobia simply smiled to her partner while tossing the piece of wood to the other girl. She then turned, grasped the frame and with a controlled application of force, began tearing the wood into pieces. Irina nodded, she understood and immediately began doing the same to the second bunk in the small room. Kiba parried a wild overheard strike to the left that opened his Grigori opponent's guard to further attacks. He twisted his wrist and thrust the blade into a jab toward his enemy. The black feathered wing of his enemy blocked the blade, however it wasn't a perfect defense as Kiba's blade sliced in causing the angel to scream out in pain. Kiba kept the blade piercing his opponent, connecting them. Pulling the pommel back, drawing the angel to him, and allowing him to deliver a devastating straight kick to his enemy's chest. His enemy was projected from the air down through a wall and into a pile of rubble. Once again he offered a quick thought of thanks to the gravity training he had undertaken. It had multiplied his strength to a level he never expected. He contemplated thanking Issei as well before shaking his head with a chuckle. Somehow he knew that it would just elevate the scion's already large ego. He spared a further moment for a tertiary glance around him. Asia floated behind him using a variety of spells to deflect and disable those that would attack them from behind. She amplified light to blind, sent powerful gusts of wind to propel back foes, and her newest spell created walls of crimson light that were sturdy enough to force members of the Grigori to have to hack their way through. The walls taxed her energy heavily, and so she created them sparingly, yet so far they had been a brilliant addition to the pair's capability. Kiba would never admit it out loud, but the enemy's numbers were starting to wear him down, and it was only through his girlfriend's ability to limit their pursuit that he was able to continue engaging foes in numbers that he could overpower efficiently. The pair swooped down and through the opening in the wall that Kiba's most recent opponent had created with his body. The angel was crumpled unconscious in rubble, however they just bypassed him. They were here to distract the enemy, find Freed, and kill him. Not kill every Grigori they encountered. They had been fighting for close to half an hour though, and now was definitely the time to move on lest they become encircled. They knew that the two holy warriors had ventured down into the catacombs, but now they had to fight their way down to join them. Finding an entrance to a hidden building when being pursued by countless assailants is something easier said than done though. An aerial pivot to the right took the pair into another set of rooms. Thralls continued to lash out, hurling anything they could at the flying devils. Another turn through an adequate opening took them into a large gorgeous room with polished wooden floors and expensive furniture. Most likely this was the office of the head honcho himself, the archbishop or dean of this cathedral. Now, it was anyone's guess to know what the Grigori had been using it for. They hadn't stripped it though, most likely out of some former reverence for the faith they held. While this room was opulent, it wasn't exactly useful to the pair. It was a dead end. Kiba spun around to lead them back out to find another approach when a pair of burly Grigori blocked the door and began unleashing a torrent of energy bolts at the pair. He instantly summoned a multitude of abyssal blades to slice and parry the energy as it directed in on them. A particularly large blast caught one of his blades. While it was deflected, it caused the sword to fire back through the air, dig into the floorboards and gauge out a portion of the wood and earth below. Kiba ignored this to continue to defend himself and Asia whilst trying to close in to defeat his foes. Asia watched as her boyfriend struggled under the constant barrage from the enemy. These Grigori were skilled and had seen enough to know that avoiding Kiba in a close fight was advisable. She searched around the room to find a way to escape or help her boyfriend. She couldn't intervene directly in his fight as her techniques would probably hinder him as much as the enemy. It was with this thought going through her mind that she watched as his summoned blade spiraled through the air and tore into the floorboards and earth below. She approached the sword, lifted it up and dug it down into the flooring beside the scar it had created. The blade pierced both the wood and compacted dirt, rock and ground easily. An idea began forming in her mind. She twisted the blade in the earth to test her theory, and it cut easily. She smiled triumphantly, spinning to face her boyfriend. "Kiba," she yelled out over the cacophony of sound, "I need 3 swords." "What?" the knight replied, "that didn't sound right." Why would his girlfriend need 3 swords? She was getting decent with her defensive martial arts techniques, however she had no training with a sword. He spared a glance toward her to see the serious, almost pouting face she replied to him with. "Just give me the swords." She replied in the authoritative tone that only a girl in a committed relationship can use on a guy. Unsure of why but willing to trust her, Kiba summoned 3 more blades in the air between himself and Asia. "Alright gorgeous, you have a plan, right?" he called out to her with his view trained back in on and closing with the Grigori, who had increased their output of energy in response to his shortening of the distance between them. "Do you really need to ask?" she fired back rhetorically with a light air of wit to her voice. It was a tone that said she definitely did have a plan, and was also a tone that made Kiba feel more at ease. This expedition to Peru had really shown Asia's leadership and quick decision skills in a light that he had never seen before. It gave him yet another sense of pride and love at how remarkable the former nun is and would continue to become. Asia gathered the swords and positioned the now 4 blades into the small hole that had been dug out already. She then stepped back and focused her magic. Air whipped up around the blades as she began creating a localized burst of wind magic. As she focused further, a small, half-meter-sized tornado whirled into existence, lifting the blades and spinning them. Directing the energy, the blades pivoted downward and began to spin at an incredible rate. The spinning blades cut through the wood and earth like butter. Asia grinned to herself. Her magical drill would burrow through to the catacombs faster than any conventional excavation equipment could. Within seconds, a thick hole was forming large enough for the pair of them to fit through. Like a children's play slide in a funhouse. She pushed more magic in to speed up the process. She wasn't sure how far down the catacomb labyrinth was, but that wouldn't matter. With this she could burrow constantly though, as the drain on her energy levels was something she could manage. It was less than 2 minutes when she felt the resistance against her blades vanish and she dispersed the magic. The noise of the wind torrent vanished at the same time as the sound of the energy blasts ceased to be replaced by the gurgling of their foes' throats being slashed open by her boyfriend's blade. Despite the enemy intending to cause untold pain and to kill both of them, Asia still found the sight of their deaths to be uncomfortable. She wasn't sure if she would ever be at a point where she could bring herself to take another's life. "Kiba," she called out, causing the blonde knight to face her. She wasted no time with words, dismissed her wings and simply leapt into the tunnel she had forged. Moments later she landed on a stone flooring far below in a hallway that looked to be at least a century old. She took a step back and positioned her arms out with a cheeky grin. A second later Kiba landed in her arms bridal style. He looked a touch flustered as she leant forward to kiss him. "Katya darlin'," she chirped with a fake Texan drawl, standing him up and smacking him on the butt playfully. "Hilarious," the boy replied in just as dry a tone but with a playful and flirtatious smile on his face. Kiba looked up and down both directions of the hallway as Asia summoned a thick barrier in the tunnel they had both used. Hopefully its positioning would be absolutely infuriating for anyone that followed them to break through, considering the width of tunnel being only of an average body. Both devils pondered their next move when Kiba frowned slightly. "Can you hear that?" he asked in a serious tone. Asia took a moment to listen and found that she could in fact hear something coming from the hallway to the rear of where she was facing. It was faint yet growing. a crackling and popping. "Is that fire?" she asked. Her boyfriend nodded and the pair moved toward the sparkling and hissing of the flames. It was only 2 corridors away when they came to the discarded body of a slain Grigori. A blade had sliced through the girl's neck. Kiba held his blade at the ready whilst Asia raised and prepared her hands to unleash magic. They approached an open set of ornate doors as yells filled the air. Yells of anger and surprise. Then the following sound was of Zenovia's voice. The 2 devils rushed forward through the doorway and came to a scene they hadn't expected. In the middle of what could be described as an open-plan living quarters was a massive bonfire of broken bedding and furniture. Barricades of broken metal blocked either side, forcing any who would cross to move through the flames. Gregorian thralls on the far side, Zenovia and Irina on the near side. The Grigori barked orders at the thralls who attempted to shift the barricades or put out the flames whilst the girls fed the growing inferno and struck them back from the metal. Clearly the Grigori wanted to push through and kill the girls. Irina spun around at the sound of footsteps behind them. Her face flushed with relief when she saw her allies arriving to join them. "Perfect timing," she called out to the hellish pair. Their plan had sort of ended at this step. They had caused a significant disruption to the enemy and forced them to move from the storage floor, but the next move eluded them. They were simply trying to avoid getting killed by the aggressive fallen angels who fired bolts of purple energy toward them whilst forcing the thralls to try to smother the fire. Multiple thralls had become burnt and a few died from inhalation, yet the Grigori didn't care. The thralls were clearly expendable to them. A fact that sickened the girls, Asia and Kiba, although the knight didn't let it hinder him. A man leapt into the fire, laying flat, attempting to use his body to create a bridge for his masters. His clothes caught fire and he began to burn alive, yet he made no attempt to save himself. Clearly he had no control over his own actions. Asia was appalled by this. The suffering of these people was something she couldn't abide. The Grigori had to be stopped. She had to save as many as possible. She knew what she had to do, a few would be hurt but the many saved. Moved, she yelled in a commanding tone at the 2 warriors of heaven. Both complied instantly with the forceful tone she used. Kiba kept behind her as Asia unleashed a more potent torrent of magical wind than she had used thus far. Flames and metal were propelled and thrown by the gale force wind she generated. She directed the flames and metal toward the Grigori. As both thralls and angels were rocketed back through the opening and into the packaging landing below, the magic bonded the flaming debris to the gusts of wind and skin of their enemies. Screams erupted as angels burst into flames. The potential of having just killed was something that Asia kept from her mind. She focused on the action of saving innocent lives. However, the use of such powerful magic after all the strain she had placed on herself thus far became too much for her, and she felt her knees bucking before dropping down with her vision blurring. She was exhausted and would be forced to rest before she could do anything further. Not wasting the opportunity that his girlfriend had created, Kiba shot forward through the now open breach and leapt over the landing down onto the area below. Angels rolled around, burning to death. Most of the human thralls lay unconscious, struck by flying metal or the hard blow to the ground, causing them to black out. Kiba focused on only one thing. In front of him stood freed Selzen and 2 other fallen angels that had not moved up to the landing above, and as such avoided the maelstrom of wind and fire that incapacitated so many of their number. Shitty, stupid devils," the deranged man ranted and screamed as he summoned 2 swords and rushed toward Kiba, flanked by his 2 lackeys. Sword at the ready, Kiba parried the strikes that came toward him at lightning speeds. Soon an elegant dance of death formed with himself, engaged in melee with the 3 adversaries. Sparks and clangs filling the air as blades clashed against one another. The wielders of the blades stepping, darting, twisting and moving in sequence with the lightning-fast twists of metal and energy. Kiba had to admit that these angels were masters of the sword in their own right. Freed fought as a man possessed and had clearly improved his own ability since last he fought the Gremry Knight. None of his opponents presented an opening, and even with his enhanced strength and stamina, Kiba found himself at a stalemate. He couldn't let frustration get the better of himself though. He continued to fight with all his talents, parrying and delivering blows at a tremendous rate. He mixed the martial art techniques that he had developed into his repertoire. These moves gave him some advantage as his strength in strikes and kicks was far greater than his foes. Irina and Zenobia watched the Gremry Knight engage their three enemies with tremendous skill and power to which they hadn't seen him portray before. He was fighting with his all. "He is so powerful," Zenobia stated with awe. They knew that Kiba was strong and skilled. A combination of natural talent and devil enhancement, but then multiplied to levels of magnitudes higher by the training he had received with issei. This did cause a thought to appear in her head, which she voiced as they watched him fight while remaining with the exhausted Asia. If he is this strong, then how strong is issei? The question wasn't meant to be answered, and yet Asia responded with a strained voice. "Kiba is the strongest swordsman I have ever met. He keeps breaking through levels that others could only dream of. But against issei, they have only sparred. However, issei could probably throw around our whole peerage with very little effort if he fought with even half his potential, let alone going close to his maximum." She chuckled out before continuing. "Don't worry about me. I just need a few minutes rest. Please help Kiba. He is more fatigued than he will admit, and I fear that it will be him and not them that will falter first." The two girls paused and then nodded in unison before picking up from beside the exhausted former nun. Moving down the spiraling steps, they came out on the far side of the room to the combating foes. Both were well aware that they would struggle to match Fried or either of the Grigori in one-on-one combat, yet they had proven that with guile and subterfuge they could negate their enemies' overmatch in raw power. They crept around the side of the room while avoiding the sightline of the foes, but stepping over the bodies that lay scattered, either dead or unconscious, around the vast floor. A pile of crystal boxes stacked close to where the fight had moved to became their destination. Both girls crept silently across the room to huddle out of direct sight beside the boxes, swords at the ready, waiting for the opportune moment. The moment arose a minute later when Kiba struck a Grigori with a strike of his left elbow. The angel stumbled back stunned, and the two girls lashed out. Zenobia buried her blade into the surprised enemy's exposed stomach. His eyes bulged and he folded forward at the midriff. Irina stepped forward, dropping her blade sharply from above. The blade decapitated the fallen angel in the single swift movement. Yells of anger came from both foes as the remaining angel disengaged from Kiba to attack Irina. His sword swung out fast and she barely parried it with her own. The force of the strike reverberated through her arms, driving her back. He came at her again and she feared for herself. Zenobia struck out at him, forcing him to twist and block her strike. This gave Irina the second required to dodge and prepare for another strike with the foe. Fighting 2-on-1 hardly offered any hope of an advantage to the girls, and moreover just bridged the gap partially between them and their Grigori foe. Blocking the heavy powerful strikes exhausted them quickly. Kiba engaged Fried freely now that this fight had become one-on-one. Immediately he found himself in a situation that was favorable to him. He was far more able to maneuver around his opponent and exploit the openings that the maniacal priest's wild fighting style opened up. The deranged man was powerful, but he threw his power around so haphazardly that Kiba could parry and dodge his way within his loose guard to deliver strikes and cuts that slashed at the man's flesh. Nothing fatal so far, but Fried sported multiple lacerations that were costing him quite a bit of blood and weakening him. Kiba wasn't getting away from this fight free of cost though, as he sported multiple welts and cuts so far, but he was definitely winning now. Fried leapt forward with a scream and wild overhead swing down toward Kiba's head. Kiba dodged to the side, blocked the blade with his own, supported by both his arms. This allowed him to twist at the torso and deliver a powerful side kick to the man's pelvis that launched him back over 24 meters through the air before crashing down into a crate of the horrid dark crystals. Kiba paused before pursuing to take a look at his allies. They were not faring well. Zenobia had been disarmed and Irina knocked to the ground. The rogue fallen angel prepared to drive his blade into Irina, but Kiba would have none of it. He darted forward toward the back of his foe. Slashing upward with his blade at a lightning pace, the blade passed effortlessly through the angel's flesh that remained still for a second before both halves of the man from pelvis to head peeled apart and dropped to the ground. The sight was disturbing, but Kiba had no time to think of the gruesome death and simply spun back around to locate his primary target. Fried stood among the crystals holding two in his hands. "Damn shitty devils," he screamed. "You die now." With it he crushed both crystals, allowing the red mist to flood into himself with great bursts of raw energy unleashed all around. Boxes, bodies, crystals, everything around him was thrown back by the force. Kiba braced himself in front of both holy warriors against the burst of energy. Fried was engulfed in swirling energy as he continued to scream profanity at the warriors. As he screamed, his voice distorted, becoming disembodied. Inhuman. Monstrous. The energy dissipated and Kiba inwardly groaned at what stood before him. Team Aquino, abandoned mansion, Paris, France. Aquino, Ravel and Sarah whipped around to face the new voice while Kaneko pulled herself up as best she could. Standing in the doorway of the destroyed kitchen was a man. A man of close to 6 feet tall, leaning lazily against the doorway frame. He sported light brown hair in a style of groomed neatly to one side, green eyes, and fair skin with a handsome complexion. His clothes were modern and stylish. 2 black devil's wings sat folded on his back. I did not mean to startle you all, mademoiselles," the newcomer spoke politely. "But you could not think that we would not respond to your actions in our city." Aquino's response to the situation was to assume the role of diplomat and negotiator. A position that she naturally aligned to quite well and that she felt quite at home with. She stepped forward toward the man with a stunning smile forming smoothly on her face. Despite the sweat of the fight, blood from the panther and messiness of her hair, Aquino still stood as a picture of beauty as she approached. "No, of course not, monsieur. In truth, we wish to speak with your faction. What better way than to begin with an act of goodwill toward your people?" Her voice airy and friendly. Subtle tones of flirtation in there, a skill that always helped when dealing with men. Kaneko heard the tones and sighed on the inside. Always Aquino would be Aquino, but she knew that her queen was only playing the part. Issei and Rias truly had her heart. The French devil's eyebrow rose in amusement as he strode out to meet Aquino halfway. Taking her hand, he kissed it before she curtsied in response. "My name is Sebastian de Mont-le-Barton. Emissary of John Le Barton," he said in a manner that told all 4 girls that Le Barton was a name that they should know. "I am Aquino Himojima, Queen of Rias Gremory. My associates are Kaneko Toju, Rook of House Gremory. Sarah Tanaka, Pawn of House Gremory, and Ravel Phoenix of House Phoenix." As she indicated to each girl, they curtsied in turn except for Kaneko, who smiled and bowed forward slightly whilst holding her injured side. Well, I am honored to be meeting members of House Gremory and their friends. To have the associates of a great Satan here is an honor. Is your lady present with you as well?" Sebastian asked in a voice that was respectfully but perhaps a little too excited to see Rias. Aquino picked up on the subtle tones but wasn't going to point them out. She didn't wish to be rude to those she was going to partition for help, and she couldn't blame the man for wanting to meet Rias. "Unfortunately not," she began. "My lady has pressing business elsewhere. We are the delegation that has been sent." She kept the smile on her face at all times while maintaining eye contact with Sebastian. "In that case, may I inquire as to what has brought you to our country? Not just to hunt down troublesome rogues, I assume." His voice remained as friendly, yet his eyes took on a suspicion that twinkled slightly. "It is a complex matter. I will happily discuss it with your lord and all those that are required to or wish to be present." Aquino responded. She knew that she was in no position nor had the power to be dictating who would be present, but by stating it, it gave the impression that she was someone who should be in such a position of authority. A small power play, so to speak. Sebastian simply nodded slowly. It was clear that he had noticed her motion and was yet to respond. He looked up with a friendly smile that could melt most women's hearts. "A moment, please, ladies." Aquino responded with a similar smile to him, of course. Sebastian stepped away, most likely to speak with his superiors, and Aquino returned back to her companions. Sarah dressed the seared wounds of Kaneko with the makeshift bandages that she had salvaged from the torn clothes and drapes hanging in the destroyed kitchen's window. The wounds were sealed yet needed to be covered to avoid the possibility of developing an infection. The Loubarton family controls most of the territory in northern France around Paris and Strasbourg, mostly Belgium and the Netherlands. Ravel stated. Inter-family politics of major and minor devil families was something that her family had forced her to learn throughout her childhood. At least now she could put a small bit of the knowledge to a useful cause for once. Aquino nodded and thanked her for forearming her before moving back to await the Frenchman's response. Sebastian returned shortly, making a waving gesture with his left hand. At once a sigil of the fleur-de-lis manifested. Deep blue with golden lilies. I will take you all to House Loubarton. Please this way, mademoiselles. His tone remained just as polite and mildly flirtatious as before, which offered only a positive outcome in Aquino's opinion. Aquino positioned herself to help Kaneko, however Sebastian strode past and offered his hand to the injured girl. Please, I insist upon French honor that you allow me to assist. His words directed to the group as much as to the white-haired girl herself. Kaneko paused briefly, with Sarah looking on awkwardly before taking the hand and shoulder offered to her. With that, Sebastian supported her weight and helped her to the circle swiftly. Once all were within the extremities of the sigil, it glowed a soft turquoise before all present vanished. Unknown location, France. The light of the sigil faded and Sebastian stepped out in front of the girls. He led the way, yet slow enough so as to still utilize his arm to continue supporting Kaneko. Please ladies, he began while pointing toward a doorway to their slight left. With that he turned with Kaneko, directing her to turn into the room, opened the door and led the group of Gremory devils into the room. Aquino took a moment to take in her surroundings before moving. They were in an opulent room. It could be said to rival the Gremory mansion, although she would never suggest such a thing to Rias or Surzex. Deep blue carpets, stained wooden walls with immaculate oil paintings. Tasteful decor. It was obvious that the Loubarton family held quite a bit of wealth and prestige. She stepped forward to follow Sebastian, and in doing so Ravel and Sarah moved as well. Aquino hadn't realized it until just then, but both had waited a moment for her to act before doing so themselves. She realized briefly how much they were looking to her for guidance and hoped that she wouldn't lead them astray. The burden of leadership felt rather heavy upon her shoulders all of a sudden in that moment. As she took in the whole room, she found it to be a formal parlor. As well styled as the room she had just left, yet with a warm fire, comfortable chairs to seat at least 20 and tables ranging from drink stands to a large oak desk that could accommodate a dozen easily. Sebastian moved Kaneko to a seat close to the fire and then opened a close dresser. He rummaged for a second before withdrawing a first aid kit. The girls moved around him as he withdrew salves and bandages. If it may help, allow us to treat Kaneko while you report our arrival, Aquino suggested. Sebastian paused in consideration for a moment before nodding to her. Smiling, he handed over the small plastic box of medical supplies and left through a second entrance. Ravel and Sarah sat in two close chairs whilst Aquino surveyed the contents in her hands. Bandages dipped in magical oils, salves of compressed shoki and other more mundane items, including a nasopharyngeal nasal airway tube, oropharyngeal throat airway tube and tourniquet. Everything a wounded devil could need to be patched up quickly. She removed some of the salves and bandages before having Kaneko lift her top. With the top up, she began stripping off the makeshift bandages that Sarah had cut. Kaneko winced slightly as a few had bonded onto her cauterized flesh, an unfortunate side effect of the circumstance. With that complete, she washed the wounds with betadine, applied the shoki salves and then dressed the whole area in the treated bandages. Her final step was to cover the bandages with a thin clear material, similar to plastic wrapping that would allow the area to breathe while keeping it as sterile as possible. Having been properly treated, Kaneko lowered her damaged top and settled back into the chair to enjoy the heat of the fire. Its radiating warmth allowed her muscles to relax and her body to calm, focusing on beginning the healing process. In one final motion, Aquino utilized her magic to repair her friend's clothing. There was no way she was allowing a member of the Gremory household to meet a foreign noble in such a state. Kaneko smiled in thanks before Aquino took a seat as well. Aquino had just felt herself begin to relax fully when a knock at the door had her sitting upright. Sebastian stood in the doorway holding it open for someone to enter. Immediately all four of the Japanese devils rose to their feet. "Allow me to introduce his lordship, Duke John Le Barton," he spoke in a tone that was polite, respectful, and with a slight hint of awe at his fellow Frenchman. Aquino could already tell that Sebastian thought very highly of his lord, and this just confirmed it further for her. An older devil entered the room. Old enough to be sporting gray hairs, and for a devil, whom age incredibly slowly, that meant something. He wore an Armani suit of charcoal with the fleur-de-lis embroidered onto the right breast. In his left hand he carried a gorgeously hand-crafted maple walking stick with a bronze header of a peacock. His eyes shone sky blue and his face wore only slight weathering as he smiled toward the girls. "I am pleased to welcome you all into my home," he began in a voice that spoke of the ages he had lived. "My name is John Le Barton and I am led to believe that you are all a delegation sent by the Satan, Sirs Ex Grammary." Aquino moved forward of the group once again, and as she met the older devil, she took his hand as it was offered and curtsied, to which he kissed her hand as Sebastian had done previously. "I am Aquino Himojima, Queen of the Peerage of Rias Grammary. We have been sent by not only our queen but also Lord Sirs Ex Grammary to enlist aid within your jurisdiction." She spoke politely yet without reserve. She wished to show that she was confident in her position. She continued on, indicating to each of her group as she did, "With me I have Ravel Phoenix of the Phoenix household, Kaneko Toju, Rook of Rias Grammary, and Sarah Tanaka, Pawn of Rias Grammary." As their names were mentioned, each girl came forward and met with the Duke. Kaneko was thankful for the salves and bandages as they allowed her to move forward. She would have felt quite ashamed if she had been unable to move forward and politely greet the senior devil. With greetings complete, the older devil took his seat, a slightly more worn yet elegant oak chair, and indicated for the girls to sit as well. "I am pleased to meet you all, yet I do wonder. What is so important that Lord Sirzek sent not just a delegation, but a delegation of his sister's peerage to meet with us?" The curiosity in John's voice was clear. It was not often that something like this occurred, and he could probably list the number of times he had encountered such a situation on one hand. The Great War being the last time, and he did hope that such an event wasn't close to repeating itself anytime soon. Aquino took a deep breath before she began speaking. She hadn't been given clear instructions on how much information she could or could not divulge. She had been pondering how much she would tell, what she would omit. But having met the Duke, she realized a few things. Firstly, he would know if she lied. Secondly, this man deserved the respect of knowing the whole truth. And thirdly, if she didn't freely give enough details, then the situation that they faced just wouldn't be believable or make sense. So with that, she began at the only place that seemed logical, with the recruiting of issei. Aquino did choose to avoid mentioning the nature of their romantic trio though. She spoke on for quite some time. Sebastian and another devil, a woman, joined the group, sitting in close behind Duke Le Barton. Aquino reached the end of her recount and reason for their arrival. Silence filled the room. Duke Le Barton pondered in his chair for a few minutes before choosing to speak. "I had heard of this warrior that fought for Lady Grammary. His display of power in the raiding game was quite extraordinary. We had been speculating as to how he became so strong, but your explanation is not one that I would have ever come to myself. Now you say there is another of his kind. One that holds allegiance with or appears to work in support of a group that could become a common threat to us all." His statement was neither a question nor directed to anyone, as yet Aquino felt it correct to reply. "That is true, Issei is the only recorded scion. Yet it would seem there is another." Aquino still wasn't sure how she felt about the prospect of another scion. She definitely didn't look forward to having to possibly face him in battle. "I would like to hear more about those who you believe are in France. Riser Phoenix and the Fallen Angel, Kokobile." The question came out with concern and a tinge of curiosity from the older noble. Aquino felt a swell of shame but was spared from having to deal with it by Ravel stepping forward. "My lord, if I may," she began, to which he gave a swift nod before she continued. She spoke of everything relevant she could regarding her brother and even some things that may not be. Having studied so extensively, she had heard of the rogue Fallen Angel General previously and gave all the information she could on Kokobile. Dukla Barton nodded as she spoke and took all the information in before turning to address his colleague. Realizing that a third member of his household had arrived, he stood and stepped aside. The new arrival stood up herself and was introduced by the Lord. "May I introduce my daughter, Marie Lou Barton?" She came up to just under Aquino in height, with green wavy hair and turquoise eyes. Her skin, a soft sun-kissed tan and smooth. She wore an opulent dress of magenta with the fleur-de-lis around the hem. Aquino was unable to guess her age, as her beauty could put her in her 20s or over a century. She stepped past her father. "I am most pleased to meet you all," her voice soft, dainty, and with the air of one who had been groomed for high court. "I truly hope that we will be able to assist in preventing those who wish to cause further harm." Aquino smiled at the girl and replied, "I am very pleased to meet you too, my lady. I am sure that with your family's assistance that we will all succeed." A few more minutes was spent exchanging pleasantries among the group before Dukla Barton cleared his throat after placing away an item into his jacket pocket that Aquino suspected was a phone. "I have made some inquiries and put out some requests for information. I have every faith that by morning I will know the whereabouts of those two fugitives. Until then, please feel free to stay in my manor. I will have rooms prepared and made available to you all." He then turned to address Sebastian directly. "Sebastian, you will chaperone these fine ladies whilst in the manor, and please ensure that Miss Tuju is given only the finest care for her bravery in defeating that menace to our society." Sebastian nodded and Kaneko couldn't help but blush slightly at the embarrassment of being the one to be fussed over. With that done, Lord Labarton and Lady Marie bid the group a good night before departing through the far door. Sebastian then led the group back through the door that they had entered through to access the parlor, and they returned to the initial room that the sigil had brought them to, a room he identified as the parlor foyer. From here he led them through the opulent manor, across two hallways and into the Poitiers wing. Sebastian noted that the wing was named after a relative of the Loubarton family, Sir Denis Morbic of Artois, a French knight who was disgraced yet regained his honor at the Battle of Poitiers in the 14th century. Aquino wondered briefly just how distant a relative the knight had been. With how long devils' lives could be, he could simply have been the Duke's cousin. For matters of simple respect and politeness, she kept these thoughts very much to herself. Within the Poitiers wing, the group were led to a set of bedrooms, each kept in immaculate condition with a large queen-size bed set with fine silken sheets and more pillows than anyone could possibly use, vanity, wardrobes and bedside tables, as well beautifully decorated wall coverings with an ensuite for each room. Sebastian ensured that each girl had settled in before leaving briefly to bring in a nursing maid to look over Kaneko's wounds. The nurse inspected each part of the injury carefully before redressing and covering the wound. The elderly nurse made comment of how the cauterizing saved Kaneko's life, yet due to its rough nature will probably leave scarring regardless of the efficiency of any future treatment. Kaneko nodded at this and kept her face expressionless while thinking about it. With the nurse out of her room and finally alone, she let a smirk cross her face at the idea of the scar. She knew that many teenage girls would be flustered by the idea of a scar spanning the length of their torso, and yet she found it humorous, almost pleasing to know that she has gained such a thing after all the fights and battles she had fought in and endured through. After ensuring that everyone had settled in well and was as relevantly comfortable as they could be, Aquino retired back into her own room, closing the door and settling herself into the immaculate bed. The soft silken sheets enveloped her totally, feeling perfect against her soft skin. Her thoughts calmed and drifted to a place of happiness, to Issei and Rias. She hoped they were both doing well and that neither had come into any trouble. With that thought, she felt herself succumbing to slumber and happily let her body drift off to sleep. Rias and Issei, outskirts of Moscow, Russia. Issei's body crashed through 4 concrete walls and tore deeply into the cold ground before coming to a sudden stop. Gashes and bloody wounds covered much of his body. His left eye was grotesquely swollen and his nose bent, squashed at an angle that was not natural. He was certain that it was broken, probably multiple breaks in the cartilage, his breathing forced through his mouth to compensate for the obstructed airways. Pain flared from every joint and nerve ending in his body as he pulled himself to his feet. Willpower alone was what kept him fighting. That and a stubborn refusal to lose to whatever it was that Biko had become. After the flashes of golden light had reduced to just his aura pulsing, Biko had stood before him transformed. His hair stood upwards, now a golden blonde, his eyes a piercing sky blue. He had grown in both height and muscle mass. His body glowed a soft gold while radiating out a sense of awe-inspiring power. Issei took this in, but then, Biko moved forward at such a speed that it had been unregisterable to all but Issei, and still had been so fast that he had been wholly unable to counter it. His reward for such an inability to respond had been a devastating punch to the stomach that had both folded him over and projected him into a nearby building. Recovering, he had drawn upon his Kaioken, yet the powerful technique had been for naught, as it offered little in bridging this gap between his strength and the one that Biko was now wielding. Since then, the Gremory Scion had been solely at the whimsy of his opponent. He had failed to land a blow and had been battered, smashed into buildings at Biko's will and beaten around their battlefield. He pushed his ki through this body to once again propel himself from the crater his body had made. He didn't need his ki sense to find Biko. The golden arsehole floated in front of him less than 100 meters away. Issei dug deep into himself. He had to fight with everything, every single iota of power, or he was going to die in this fight. Multiply 7, he bellowed out with the flaming red aura of the Kaioken enhancing over itself. The sudden rush of strength, power and ability surged through him as his ki worked in overtime. Issei knew that the cost would be a heavily taxed endurance, and so darted toward Biko to begin the melee anew. He opened with a right cross that was blocked and countered with driving kick. Unlike previous engagements, Issei had time now, fractions of a second, to see the blow coming toward him and was able to produce a rough counter. He dropped down, allowing the kick to pass over him as he struck out with a left uppercut. His eyes remained on Biko, and he saw an instance of fury cross the golden Scion's face as his attack missed the mark before he blocked Issei's uppercut with his left forearm. Strike against strike, blow for blow, the two Scions fought. Buildings began to crumble at the sheer shock of the power being thrown around by the two titans. Issei felt his concern back off slightly. He could now engage Biko without being used as a beating bag. The nagging thought at the back of his mind told him that pushing his Kaioken this far was only letting him survive. Not even close to being able to win. Rias felt her chest tighten as she watched the red and gold blurs crashing into each other. She had arrived at the battle site to watch Issei being pummeled by Biko in his new state. Watching the boy she loved be beaten mercilessly and tossed around like a rag doll caused tears to well in her eyes, falling silently down her cheeks. She wanted to intervene to help him, but how could she? She would struggle to match Issei in the first stage of his Kaioken, and with him being so overmatched, then she could hardly assist. As if he could read her thoughts from only her body language, Vala spoke up from behind with a tone of smugness that grated against Rias' ears. "There's nothing you can do. Biko's a super scion. God himself couldn't stand against him, let alone stop him." The outcast devil's voice was full of the same smug pride that he had voiced when first speaking to Issei. Rias glared at him for a second but didn't bother to respond. While she fretted for her boyfriend, her analytical brain couldn't help but absorb the information she heard. Super Saiyan, she mumbled the word softly to herself. Issei unleashed his Kaioken at his maximum. She felt relief as he was no longer getting tossed around haphazardly. The speed of movement that the two warriors were fighting at was of a level that neither devil could comprehend, for even with their enhanced sight, they could only see the two for brief moments when they stopped moving as their strikes collided, much like watching a collage of still-captured photographs of the action occurring before them. Biko feinted a strike to the left, causing Issei to block to the wrong side. The Japanese boy paid for his mistake instantly as a whip kick crashed into his right side. The force propelling him through the air and into a dilapidated building which crumbled loudly at the shock of the impact caused by the body of the supercharged teenager. Issei bellowed out, causing the remains of the structure to collapse from his emanating power as he fired himself toward Biko once more. Yet again the two scions clashed in a cacophony of strikes. Rias stood beside the crater that Biko had emerged from with Vala beside her. Neither devil had any intention to engage the other, simply watching the fight before them. A rumbling caught Vala's attention and he turned to watch vehicles approaching. He rescinded his wings into his back as they approached where the two devils stood. Rias noticed the sound and did the same. The three vehicles stopped close by, two hatchback cars and a van. Moments later, a group of people that the devils recognized as patrons of the concert came out. Over a dozen people stood by their cars with the phones out recording everything. While they could only see slight gold and red blurs repeatedly striking into each other, the sound of the two scions fighting was easily loud enough for anyone to hear. The group speculated among themselves as they filmed. Rhea saw some of the phones turn toward where she stood and groaned inwardly. Centuries of the supernatural beings keeping themselves unseen, and her boyfriend had almost single-handedly ended that. She pushed those thoughts aside as well. Fallout from this could be dealt with after ensuring that Issei survived. Issei was becoming more exhausted by the moment, his stamina was plummeting, and he knew that he would be unable to maintain his Kaioken much longer. It was at this moment that he decided he would have to go out with everything and leave nothing left. Issei parried a left hook and pushed himself apart from Biko. He took a quick breath. Multiply 9, the combination of the intense increase in power and strain on his body both compounded onto his system. He shot forward within Biko's guard and crashed his right fist into his enemy's jaw. Biko was driven back, partially from the hit and partially from the shock of Issei landing a direct blow on him. Issei didn't waste his opening and instantly clawed his hands by his side. All or nothing. He poured every aspect of his enhanced energy into the attack forming in his hands. He knew that he would pay the price later, but the here and now was what concerned him. He controlled the entire pool of the energy's flow into his palms as he finalized the purple attack. Immediately throwing both hands forward, he bellowed out, "Fire!" Instantly an incredibly powerful beam of purple energy unleashed from Issei. The beam far exceeding anything he had ever produced before in size, volume of power, or exertion. His aura and beam twisted into a mixture of vibrant reds and purples as the attack pierced the sky toward Biko. The golden scion had no time to counter the attack and so thrust his arms forward. The raw energy crashed into his arms and he pushed back with his ki. The result was the devastating attack being caught by Biko, although he was pushed back through the air close to 40 meters before slowing the momentum enough to stop his rearward movement. While stopping the beam's advance, Biko was now unable to move away whilst fighting against the energy that Issei had unleashed on him. To the spectators below, the entire scene suddenly became clear. With neither scion able to move anymore, everyone, be they devil or human, was immediately able to watch as the two struggled with the colossal beam of energy. Neither Rias nor Vala knew how to respond. This had never happened before. All they could do was continue to watch and await the outcome. Issei grunted and struggled to maintain the beam. He could feel Biko's ki pushing against the far end of his attack and knew that he needed more power. He steeled himself to increase his Kaioken once more when he suddenly felt a profound snap occur deep within himself. Incredible, excruciating pain, more than he had ever felt, flooded through his entire being, overloading his entire nervous system, and instantly, as if a switch had been flipped, his strength was gone. His control of both the Gallic gun and Kaioken left him. He was dropping from the air with the ground rapidly approaching. The crash lasted but a moment as Issei felt nothing register from his body and his world turned black. Biko felt Issei's power vanish and clapped his hands together, squeezing onto the purple beam that was still pushing into him before unleashing it upward toward the stars. The beam flowed upward and dissipated out into the very heavens, where it exploded in a burst of purple pulsating lights high in the mesosphere, each individually breaking apart and fading to nothingness. He took a moment to control his breathing before looking down at the unconscious form of his fellow scion. Biko dropped to the ground beside his opponent as he heard footsteps rapidly approaching. Rias dashed blindly forward, sprinting toward Issei. He could no longer defend himself. She had to help Issei to save him. Her thoughts were single-minded as she approached his crumpled, bleeding, and broken form. Before she could arrive, the glowing, golden Biko landed beside Issei's unconscious body, facing down toward him. Panic flowed further through her. Biko looked up at her with a face devoid of emotion. His vision returned to Issei and he stretched his hand out. Green energy gathering in his palm. "No!" she screamed at him. She formed compressed orbs of destruction energy that she immediately hurled at the man in rapid succession as she ran. The spheres of energy that she had once believed to be unstoppable merely popped harmlessly as they struck his aura. Tears fell freely down her face, tears at the frustration of her power being negligible, at the feeling of hopelessness, but mostly at the risk of losing the boy she loved entirely. She threw herself down over Issei, shielding him as she lifted up his battered and barely alive form. Holding his heavily bleeding torso and head in her arms as she cradled the man she loved. She didn't care for the force of unbelievable green energy pointed at them both. She just held Issei, the only thing she could do. Footsteps stopped near her as Vala joined his friend. "What are you going to do, Biko?" he asked the golden scion. A pause followed with silence that was broken by only Ria's sobs, the hum of Biko's energy and the distant murmurs of the spectators' voices. The hum of the energy stopped and Rias clenched her eyes expecting pain. Pain that never came. She looked up to see the green energy gone and Biko's hand by his side. "Nothing," the Super Saiyan replied, "this weakling means nothing to me, even the largest Zenkai won't help him," his voice cold, gruff and dismissive. With that said, the blinding light of his golden aura vanished. His hair and eyes returned to their natural brown. He rose silently into the air, immediately flying off over the now destroyed Soviet-era buildings and into the night. Valley waited a moment before shrugging and unleashing his wings, furling them to take flight. "Well, all right then," he responded to the shrinking form of his departing companion. Vala beat his wings to gain a meter of flight before pausing his ascent to address Rias without looking at her. "You're lucky tonight, Gremory. Biko always kills any who he fights. This mercy is rare beyond belief for him." His voice more informative than mocking. Rias didn't respond, she simply wept with her eyes closed while holding the devastated, ravaged and almost unrecognizable form of the boy she loved. His breathing shallow and weak yet still most importantly present. He was alive and that was all that mattered to her at this time. After more than a few deep sobs, she looked at Issei. Valley was long gone, she could hear the spectators getting closer. Issei was covered in blood. His face was swollen grotesquely and many of his bones were broken. Blood oozed from wounds all over his body. He needed medical attention. Snow fell softly from the sky as the wind brought a further chill to the air. The white particles landed on the ground and mixed with the scion's blood on the bitumen to form a macabre sludge. Rias took a deep breath to stable herself and summoned the Gremory sigil. Now was not the time for subtly. Lifting Issei into her arms, she shifted herself to stand on the rows of her family. She faced the spectators briefly and then vanished. Gone were the combatants, but remained was the damage and carnage their destructive duel had wrought, indisputable evidence that humanity was not alone in the world.